Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar Applying Transportation Asset Management to Intelligent Transportation Systems. My name is Nilu Parvinashtiani and I'll be helping with facilitating today's webinar. This webinar is sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration and hosted by the National Operations Center of Excellence, also known as NOCO. I wanted to cover a few logistics for today's webinar before we get started. We are recording this session, and that recording, along with the PDF of the presentations, will be available through the on-demand learning section of the NOCO website. Alternatively, you can also download the PDF of the slides from the download pod on your screen right now. All attendee forms are on listen-only mode by default, but we'd like you to stay engaged by using question discussion pods for comments and questions. We have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, so if you have any questions, please enter them into that question discussion pod as they come to your mind at any time. The questions will be read out loud one at a time by the moderator, and our presenters will answer each question. So that's all I have with the logistics, and with that, I'll hand it over to our moderator, Joe Gregory, to start us off. Joe.
All right, thanks so much, Nilu. Just making sure, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So real quick, thank you all for joining us today. So we just want to go over some of the efforts we've been undertaking over the past couple of years in terms of what we've been researching as far as applying asset management principles to both traffic signals and ITS assets. With us this afternoon, we have myself, obviously, I'm Joe Gregory with the FHWA Office of Operations. We also have our consulting team, Erin, Flanigan, Gareth Mckay, Christopher Senesi, that's going to be assisting us today as well and help covering the material that will be coming out in the, hopefully soon, some publications that will be posted online. Some primers. So with that, I just want to cover the first couple slides and I'll turn it over to them. But today, I just want to give you a quick overview of the project. And sorry, let me back up here. And then just cover the material that we found throughout our research and just some emerging themes that have come up through this effort. So as part of this effort, we went through a lot of literature review, both here in the U.S. and also international, so we'll share some international examples too, but also highlight some emerging themes that repeatedly came up through this process. So just to give you a good overview of why we're pursuing this project, we've noticed over the past few years that there seems to be a bit of a convergence between the TSMO world and the asset management world. So if you envision a Venn diagram of two circles, that overlapping area seems to be becoming larger and larger. You've had a lot of discussion in the TSMO world where historically it's centered around deploying technology. So we've had congestion issues, we've had reliability issues. So with TSMO, it's very technology heavy. So a lot of solutions are focusing on, okay, where can we deploy these ITS assets? And questions like how do we maintain them, how do we operate them throughout the life cycle, have historically been more of an afterthought, but we're starting to see these questions come up more and more in recent years. And then looking over in the asset management world, where historically they focus primarily on pavements and bridges, we're starting to see more conversations into other assets that include both signals and ITS. So the rationale behind this project is when you have those convergence in these two worlds and more opportunity for dialogue on top of the asset management, the transportation asset management plan requirements that came out of MAP 21, we saw this as a good opportunity to really figure out, okay, how do you apply these asset management principles to these assets that's in line with these TAMP requirements. So we'll get into more detail on that later. Recognizing that the state DOTs are only required to pursue to add pavements and bridges, but they can pursue other assets if they wish. We're hoping these primers can be a good resource for you to do that if that's what you states decide to do. If they don't decide to do it, we're hoping it can still be a good resource for them to apply asset management to their ITS assets in other ways. So we're hoping it can be beneficial all around. So when we talk about ITS asset, I mean, we're saying that TSMO practices, I mean, they're always continuing to evolve. The term TSMO has been around for quite a number of years now, but there's always new strategies that come up and just different new ways of doing the same strategies to make it more efficient. And that's when we might continue to evolve. And then recognizing, like I said, it's very technology heavy. So you have a lot of ITS assets that are critical to both the safety, mobility, and even reliability of the highway system. But also recognizing that once these are deployed, once these are installed, there is a significant commitment to operate, maintain, update, even replace. We'll even get into issues of obsolescence that seems to have come up as well. And then also the evolution of asset management, going all the way back to ICE-T, but and continue to see that evolve and to being applied to other assets. So these are the requirements in the TAMP in these bullet points right here that we'll cover. So we'll hit on these areas repeatedly throughout this presentation. This right here, this is a figure that came from the AASHTO Asset Management Guide, and we try to utilize that and just have somewhat of a discussion in the primer in terms of how does asset management and transportation performance management, how does that relate? And especially when we start getting into ITS, that connection becomes even more significant. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Gareth and Christopher to go over some of the emerging themes that came about. And just give you a quick background, when we started looking throughout the literature, we held listening sessions with state and local DOTs about the challenges they're facing, some of the successes that they've had, especially as it relates to the TAMP requirements. We started to pick up some common themes that came up over and over again. So you see these 5 themes here that will go more into detail. And these are the themes that emerge and where we see the potential connection points with the asset management plan requirements. So with that, I will turn over to Gareth or Christopher, and they can take it from there. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. As Joe mentioned, we're going to do a quick run through of these 5 emerging themes that have been brought together as a result of all the research that was undertaken. So what we're going to go through probably in the next 30 to 40 minutes is a quick overview of each of these themes. There is a lot more detail in the primers that will be available very soon, but it's really just to give you a flavor of what is in there, why it's in there, and you can go and find out a little bit more about these items. We'll also talk through some examples, so you'll know who to go and ask and who to go and talk to in terms of some of the work that's been done in the past addressing these themes for ITS asset management. We're going to talk about asset identification, understanding what assets you have, where they are, and what state of their life they're in. We're then going to talk a little bit about once you start collecting that information, you may want systems to help you make decisions. So we'll talk a little bit about how management systems could do that. We're going to touch on once you have those systems and you want to start thinking about how the assets you've got, how they're actually delivering performance. And I think this is there's a lot going on here from an ITS perspective when we talk about performance measures. What we're going to focus on here is having those assets, those ITS assets available and actually doing what they intend to do. But obviously from an ITS perspective, things can look a lot more broader than that. When we're looking at performance, we want to make sure we maximize that performance. So thinking about the interventions that take place, the maintenance actions that an agency does to look after those assets. And if we want to make a change in terms of how we look after those assets, what are the resources that are required to do that? One of the big challenges with ITS is a lot more new assets and an expansion of those assets coming on board, and we work with a lot of agencies that are grappling with that and trying to understand what that will cost them in the future. So on this slide, you can see the 5 themes on the left-hand side, and as Joe introduced earlier, we've got the TAMP elements on the right. The focus within the primer is really around, what are the things from an asset management perspective agencies should be thinking about regarding their ITS assets. But through doing those things, you'll see on the right-hand side, a lot of those TAMP elements will be addressed through that process. Sometimes you'll see some of those elements appearing multiple times as we go through this, but our focus is on those themes of let's get that asset management right, and the TAMP elements will take care of themselves. So let's start off with asset identification. The first thing to think about when we're talking about asset identification is what assets are we talking about? It's not an easy thing to answer, but something that every agency will have to grapple with. When we do identify those assets, we want to look at what information or attributes of those assets we want to collect and why do we want to collect it is the important bit. And also, once we collect information, how we're going to make sure we manage that over time to make sure that it's accurate and reliable. If you're going to put the time and effort into collecting information, you want to make sure when someone goes there to use it, they're getting the right stuff and it is accurate. Otherwise, they'll quickly lose confidence in what you've got there. The definition that you see on the screen is the Federal Highway definition of an asset. And there's been a lot of debate as we went through this process. You'll see here it talks about physical highway infrastructure located within the right-of-way. And you're all aware that when we're talking about ITS assets, a lot of what is required to deliver the performance that those assets do provide may sit outside the right-of-way. It may not be those assets that are adjacent to the highway or the road or run alongside it. Where there's operations centres and processes associated with that, and a whole lot of other important things that are required to deliver a performance outcome. So that's acknowledged. The focus of most of what we'll talk about today is the infrastructure within the right-of-way, but the principles of what we'll talk about today can be expanded beyond that into all types of assets that you may be responsible for. In terms of level of detail, we have 2 examples here. So we've got an hour station on the left-hand side. We're talking about just looking at that as one asset, a station as an asset. So you want to know, if you're looking at that, you want to know how many hour stations you have and where are they located. Perhaps once you start to understand that, or you'll intuitively know that, you may want to think more, look at a more granular level at some of the components that make up that station. And the reason you may want to do that is because you'll have different approaches to how you manage those assets. It may be that some last longer than others, and you want to understand all those bits and pieces. And so you need to make that decision, what level of detail you want to go to. The resounding message that we got from agencies was start simple. So start simple and then build on that when you have that need, or you can see that need come in for why you might want to collect more information. So building on that a little bit with Oregon DOT. And this slide really reinforces some of the things I just mentioned. So you want to capture location and asset classes and think about the subgroups or the components that make up those assets. When you're looking at components, you need to have a hierarchy in place. So all components of assets are linked into one overall asset, so you know all the pieces that sit within that RS site. So you want to make sure that that is all clearly connected together, and you have a process to do that. But Oregon DOT was one of those agencies that said continually review what information you need to collect at a component level to ensure that you're tracking it correctly and to ensure that it's informing a decision you're making now or you want to make in the near future. So a lot of time and energy is spent collecting data and information on assets. You want to make sure that it's actually informing a decision that you will make. Utah DOT is an agency that has specific tiers set up for their assets, and ITS is one of those assets that sits at that top tier alongside pavements and bridges. And in identifying ITS assets at that level, there are some specific requirements in terms of information that needs to be collected about those assets, the ability to predict what's happening with those assets, and also but also make sure it has dedicated funding associated with them. From Utah DOT's perspective, they identified some critical factors if you want to collect asset information. Again, here we see limit the number of assets and attributes being collected. So start simple and then build on that. It was important from their perspective that there was a link between that initial data collection and the maintenance and work order activities that happened on those assets, to make sure that if someone went in there and did something to an asset, that information was also collected. And the inventory was updated on a regular basis, so it was always current. They mentioned that it was important that staff understood the reason they were collecting data. Often when you're collecting this sort of information, people have to make some decisions about interpreting how they're collecting that information, and understanding the use of it is obviously going to be important for that, and give them some reason for what they're doing. So making sure that is was something they saw as important. They also thought it was really critical that for those that were collecting or updating this sort of asset information, that they had they were able to do that using mobile hardware. So they saw that as really important from an efficiency perspective for those that were doing the work, and also making sure that the information was accurate, not getting recorded and then transferred and then moved around. So recording it once and getting it right. So from an asset identification perspective, a quick summary in terms of some of the things to think about here. Start simple. Start at the highest level, add attribute and data collection incrementally, introducing new types of attributes or information you want to collect through a phased approach. So think about that. Identify the most critical components as you look to expand, and make sure that when you're collecting component level data, you have a good process in terms of linking it all through to the overall asset that you're collecting information about. So moving on to our next theme, which is about management systems for assets. There's a lot of things that management systems can help you with, and we're calling that system functionality. We'll talk through what that might be, and that's a first step in terms of thinking about what you might want. It's also important to think about, when you're thinking about systems, is think about how you're going to link into a broader agency location-based system. So how are you going to be able to pull up this information through the different systems that you have in place, and how are you going to link into linear referencing, etc. I'm going to talk a lot about interfaces and integration of systems within an agency, and making sure that that is clearly understood. And always when you go through one of these processes, it can be a big change for people. And when things are changing, when you've got new systems in place, or you're changing how you utilize existing systems, you need to make sure that you involve those that are going to need to use the system to make sure that any implementation and adoption is successful. From a system functionality perspective, we've got 2 slides here of when you're looking at managing your ITS assets. There's a range of different functionality that you may want to have available or have a system to support you with. The first couple there are asset identification, asset condition, and we've talked a little bit about that in the previous theme. We also touched on work planning and management. So understanding what work is planned, when it gets done, and how that changes things, and also the level of effort and the cost associated with doing that work is an important thing to understand. Materials management is something within your agency you'll want to be wary of. What parts do you have available? Where is it? And the like. For technology assets, warranties are very important. We want to understand when something is within warranty and when it isn't, and make sure you have a way to track that. A number of agencies have had some challenges with that part of the process. And once you start to collect this information, you want it to help inform your planning and budgeting. You may want to do some analytics on it to be able to understand and feed into things like life cycle planning, and that we'll touch on a little bit later, and ultimately report information. So understand where things are at, what has been done, and make sure that's easily accessible to those that may want to know about it. So there's a broad range of functionality that's been listed on these 2 slides. You need to think about all this at the start. Think about what systems you already have in your agency that enable you to undertake some of this functionality, and you may have some gaps that you want to fill, but really start off by thinking about what do you want to do and what have you already got in place to help you do that. Minnesota DOT went through an asset management system implementation, and they were really happy with how that went. So we had a quick discussion with them about what they saw, why they thought that was successful. And there's the 5 bullet points that they've mentioned here. So the implementation team, those that were setting up the system for them, they made sure that they had them available and they could call on them after they pressed go and the system went live, and they needed to call on them, so that was useful to them. They recognized that there was real benefit in putting in some time and effort to making this a success. So they had dedicated resources internally to help drive that. This included things like making sure they were doing a lot of QA on the information that was getting put in the system, and using that QA to go back to those that were putting the information in and focusing on training and understanding for those people to make sure that they were getting it right first time. So they put some effort into that. I'm sure that effort went down over time, but recognizing you wanted to have high quality information, and so they had resources associated with that. They had stakeholders involved all the way through the process in terms of coming up with system requirements through the implementation, and then those people became champions as they went through and went live with the system. Being able to talk to other systems within an agency, there's always going to be those interfaces. They can be a challenge at times, but that can be worked through and it can be a success. Whether you want to pull together information about your assets, you might want to pulling in financial information associated with those assets, etc. You'll often have different systems that need to talk together, and being able to pull that or at least make sure you can align outputs from those different systems is really critical. And then they also put a lot of focus on making sure that there was user-friendly reporting coming out of the system. So people could get what they wanted, when they wanted. There was some flexibility on how they presented it, and thinking about, I guess, with that stakeholder group, thinking about that early on in terms of what they were going to need at the end and making sure it was available for people. So from a systems perspective, the first thing is identifying your requirements. What are the business and functional requirements you require to make some of the asset management decisions you're looking to do? Look at what you already have, identify what gaps or interface improvements might be necessary, involve a broad stakeholder group in terms of making those decisions and working together on that, and make sure you capture as much as you can that you already have in place. Involving the stakeholders in that early process feeds into the second key part of the slide, which is making sure you have an engagement plan, you have those people involved all the way through. So think about starting with a pilot to make sure you iron out any creases within the process and learn from that part of it. And then once you actually put things into place, that stakeholder engagement also continues as you monitor the use and get feedback on it. Really important to recognize that you will have different types of users of these systems. There'll be those that use it day in, day out, every day, multiple times a day. And then there'll be infrequent users who may only need to use it once a month or even once a year, and realize that they have different needs in terms of how they access things, how they find out how to access things, because they may need to learn each time they go in. But think about those different users from an engagement perspective. Performance measures and targets. So really, when we're talking, we understand the criticality of ITS assets to the overall mobility of a system, and that's why they've become so important and so critical, and will continue to do so as technology improves. And really, what we're talking about here from an asset management perspective is making sure those important assets are available. So they're actually there, they're actually operating, and they're doing what they're supposed to do. So they're functioning as intended. And there's kind of two ways to look at it. They're both very much related. But the first one we've got in there is asset reliability or condition. So that is a function, that is identifying, yes, that ITS asset is available to us and it is working. But the second bullet point on here is really about the resiliency of those assets. So when something goes wrong, how are we able to respond to that? How quickly can we get that asset up and running again so it is functioning? And that second bullet point contributes to the outcome you achieve on the first, but we've often found that there's a lot of agencies look to measure these two things differently, so that they could manage to both of those different performance measures. Some examples here. So this one's from Nevada DOT, and this is looking at ITS condition. So the image that you can see on the screen there looks at how they define good, low, medium, and high risk assets. And you can see there that the condition description is based on the age of those assets and the age of that relative to the manufacturer's recommended service life. So this is the initial starting point for Nevada DOT. You can see with the second bullet point, they are able to look into the future and understand the cost for them to maintain their current level of service or their current condition levels, and they have a number that they've associated with that. But as I mentioned, this is the starting point for Nevada, and they are moving towards a component-based approach. So instead of looking at an overall station, they'll look at the separate components of that, and incorporating both age, as they've got here, but also inspections on condition and understanding those inspection outcomes to also help them measure the performance that they're achieving. This example from Highways England talks about that asset availability, the asset availability metrics, and it also talks about tracking time to resolve maintenance issues for ITS. They recognise that not every ITS asset is the same, and different assets have different criticalities. So they have been through a process of putting those ITS assets into performance categories and have different expectations from a response perspective for those different assets. And on the next slide, we will see a little bit more about these different performance categories. You can see here that the most critical assets are in performance category 1. And the expectation here is that for performance category 1, those assets will 100% of the time, those assets will be restored and faults restored within 24 hours. If we go to category 2, you have a little bit more, there's a little bit more leeway, and it'll take 48 hours before 100% of those assets are back in place. And for category 3, although 90% of the assets need to be back in place within 168 hours, it's actually a lot longer, 56 days, until everything needs to be fixed. So those are the expectations from a response perspective. Those are measured and reported against to see what is happening and how improvements can be made. And through measuring that, they're also able to, and the bottom line here looks at how that relates into an overall availability for those assets. So not surprisingly, when you've got a longer response time, the availability of those assets is reduced, as we can see when we compare category 3 to category 1 along that bottom line. So from an asset management performance perspective, the first one is to think about what sort of measures you want to set, and looking at the measures first comes before setting targets. You probably want to understand how you can perform before you set targets. So review what you want to measure, and importantly how you can measure it. So within the framework there, what is the data you need to collect to be able to track performance measures, making sure you have ways to be able to do that in order to measure your performance. You'd want to start tracking that data, but again, link it back to decision making. So we're collecting this information. What are we using it for? Are we using it to make a difference? What are our expectations around making a difference? And important for those that are involved in collecting the information, make sure you send feedback on how the information is being used, that it's being looked at, that we're using it to make a range of different decisions, and so make sure that people understand that it's important to you as an agency, and it's something that you're tracking. Once you start to understand your performance that you're achieving and you're starting to collect information about your assets and you have ways of storing it, then you'll want to jump into something that we call life cycle planning. So life cycle planning is the process to estimate the cost of managing an asset over its whole life. No surprises that from an asset management perspective, you want to try and minimize that cost over the life of an asset, but it's about making decisions about how you're going to respond, and that's where maintenance management approaches come into it. There's a lot of discussion within the PRIMA about different maintenance management approaches and what they mean, but there's 3 of them listed there. The first one is condition-based. So understanding the condition of an asset and doing something or responding when condition reaches or is predicted to reach a certain level. The second one is interval-based. So assigning a timeline to something, saying that every year we're going to go and do this to this asset, or every 5 years we're going to go and replace this. The third one there is reactive-based. Pretty simply, that means when something's broke, we're going to fix it. So 3 different approaches there that are all very different, all have very different costs and implications. All of these approaches are right. That's the most important thing from my perspective. Not everything in this world needs to be condition-based. The time and the effort to collect data on all that is huge and probably unnecessary. But there will be elements within your ITS system where you might want to understand condition. There might be some where you want to have an interval-based approach, and there might be some where you're happy just to be reactive and respond when necessary. It's important to understand what approaches you want to take and why you want to take it. And that's what lifecycle planning is about, understanding what you're doing, what else you could do, is that a better approach or not, and understanding that. So lifecycle planning is about understanding how you're managing your assets. From a federal highway perspective, that last bullet point talks about federal highway work types. And when we're talking about the way that assets are managed, Federal Highways is encouraging agencies to talk about these different work types, from maintenance through to reconstruction and initial construction. It's up to agencies how to define these, how you want, and think about what they mean to you. But it's important just to recognise that for pavements and bridges, there is a requirement to talk about things in terms of these work type categories, and so it may be something to consider as well when we're looking at ITS assets, just to be aware that those exist. I've got a couple of slides here as an example from Australia. Austroads has a couple of good guides about how they manage ITS assets. This first slide here talks about the range of different ways that they predict performance of their ITS assets, and no surprises here. I mean, a lot of these things are used here as well. Manufacturers' recommendations or performance data, we saw an example of that earlier on being used. The judgment of those who know these assets best is obviously an important piece as well. Looking at what others are doing, what are others experiencing, learning from that. Looking at your own records. So within your agency, what information do you have? How does that inform things? And then in terms of predicting performance, they utilize all those different types of data to do some analysis and use predictive models through management systems to look at the cost of alternatives and what their overall performance they might be able to achieve. This is an example from their guide to asset management for ITS assets. This is just one line. There's a number of pages of a whole range of different ITS assets where they've been through this type of analysis to talk about how they do things. So they've broken it down into the different asset groups. We've got one here for electronic communications. They talk about the types of failure and failure modes that may occur, and how they go about predicting when these things are going to happen, and the data required for monitoring and understanding these. So there's some good resources there. They're listed within the primer, and you can have a look at that and get more information about the approaches they take. With a highly technical asset like ITS, obsolescence is a real issue. Technology can become obsolete because it's no longer connected. I was listening to a presentation yesterday from Colorado DOT, and they were talking about a number of message signs that they had on their network that they could no longer communicate with, and had them programmed to be replaced. So, you know, the connection can become difficult, even though the asset is still working. It's in good condition and it's doing what was initially intended to do from a functional perspective, that asset was obviously not functioning as designed because they couldn't communicate with it and make it and get it to do its job. Assets may also become obsolete because it just makes sense to replace them. So there's significant benefit from a mobility and reliability perspective in terms of replacing those assets. And so it may still be working, it may still be connected, but there's just something newer and smarter out there, and it just makes sense from a mobility perspective to replace it, even though the other thing is working fine. So it's important to realize that these different obsolescence outcomes can shorten the expected life of an asset. So in a couple of slides ago, we talked about, the manufacturer's recommendation about how long these things should last. That may not be the number that drives when we need to plan to replace these assets. It might be when it's going to be obsolete. Planning for obsolescence is a challenge because sometimes we don't know about it until it's already here. So we have touched a little bit on the asset life cycle, and we've talked a little bit about that so you understand what's going on there. The next 3 bullet points is really about assessing risk, assessing component risk within an asset. And within the primer, there's a lot of discussion about reliability-centered maintenance, or RCM, and looking at how you identify the most critical parts of some of these systems that you're delivering, and using that to think about when something's going to become obsolete and what impact that has on the overall delivery of the ITS outcome. So you want to consider those, think about how that changes over time. It's really important to continue to look at this as new information becomes available. As you hear of others having problems, etc., you want to continually challenge what you do from an obsolescence perspective. And as you learn, think about those strategies that you've got in place. With all risk strategies, it's about understanding what options are available to you in terms of mitigating that risk. It may be that there are actions that you want to take, but you don't have the resources to be able to undertake them, and so you have to accept that risk. And if you've gone through a process of identifying the criticality and thinking about that risk, then perhaps you're better placed to communicate, hey, just be aware that we're not addressing this, but this is the risk we've had to accept in this situation. Another example here from the Nevada DOT. So looking at their lifecycle planning strategies for ITS assets. And they have here a number of different actions that they can take as they look to manage those assets. So whether that's from inspection, through minor to major repairs, or replacement of those assets. These are all strategies that are available to Nevada DOT. They may not be available for you for all assets that you have, but these are the ones that they have identified. They then went through a process of looking at life cycle planning. And in order to do that, they started off by thinking about the actions they take and what impact that has. So what this slide is showing is that, for example, if they have a ITS asset that is a low risk at the moment, so it's in pretty good condition, they can go out there and they can do a minor repair on that asset, and it will move it from a low risk to good condition. If they have a medium risk asset, they understand that if they go and do an inspection or a minor repair, it's not going to change its condition, but if they do a major repair on it, it is potentially going to move it up to that low risk category. So they thought about the different assets they had. They looked at a range of different assets, from CCTV through to ramp meters and AWIS, and they did a 20-year analysis and looked at the assets they had, how that condition was changing, the actions they were taking here. and did some analysis looking at whether they were making the right decisions to go out there and do these minor and major repairs and these inspections. And with all the assets they looked at, it clearly showed that the approach they were taking was much better than just waiting for it to, was much more profitable for them and reduced their life cycle costs than just going out and replacing things when things went wrong. So if you want to see more about, read more about that example, that's within their 2019 TAMP. So from a life cycle planning perspective, what we're looking to do here is maximize the performance of those assets. We do, the previous theme we were talking about performance. We want to maximize that performance. So what you first want to do is understand what you currently do from a maintenance management approach perspective. Simply recording and writing it down and making people aware of it is a great first step. Once you've done that, assess what different approaches are available to you and see if that is an improve and that would make an improvement or not. Consider the risk of obsolescence and how that might be introduced to those different approaches, and when that's likely to become an issue for some of your assets. And then utilize those findings to inform investment decisions. We're going to talk about that in the next theme a little bit, but being able to communicate the outcomes from this type of analysis is really important if you do want to make a change. The last point there is continually look at that as you get more information, a better understanding of your assets, then continue to think about this. Your best approach will change over time, and it'll depend on the cost of doing things, which is always changing, and the resources that you have available, and the assets that you have. So continually think about this and update what you're doing. Okay, we understand performance. We understand the options that are open to us in terms of how we manage the assets, and now we want to think about allocating resources to do it. So there's two types of information that we might want to look at from a resource allocation perspective. That might be the cost to deliver a strategy. So if we take this approach, what is the outcome going to be and how much is it going to cost? And the second one is if we have a specific funding scenario, what can we achieve? How will we prioritize, and what will get done and what won't get done? And being able to communicate both of these things is really important. There's a number of different areas and ways you may want to communicate these. The first one is making sure that stakeholders understand the expected outcomes. So those that are making decisions about how things are done, when things are done, the resources and the funding available, understand, be able to put information in their hands so they can see what the impact of those decisions are. Unless they can see it, unless you can communicate it to them, it's a real challenge to get anything to change. Once a decision has been made from a resourcing perspective, it's then really critical to convey what that means for those that are actually delivering the management and maintenance and management of those assets. So if there is a reduction in funding or more funding, you want to understand the impacts of that. Make sure that for a large agency, make sure those changes are applied consistently across the agency. So once the decision is made, make sure everybody understands what that means in terms of what's going to be delivered. I talked on the previous slide about wanting to make a compelling story for different investment options or investment scenarios. Something that is used a lot around the world, and even more so here, is talking about asset valuation. I think, from my perspective, asset valuation is a very powerful way of communicating things. It's not everybody understands what good, fair, or poor condition means, but everybody understands what $1 is, what $100 is, and what $1,000 is. So if we can start to communicate the value of these assets through an asset valuation approach, it can make it easy for people to understand what the future looks like and the level of responsibility that they have. There's a couple of examples there about different asset valuation methods: replacement value, condition-based value, and there's a little bit more discussion about that in the primer. There is a lot of research out there about asset valuation, some very recent work that's been done looking at asset valuation that you can, if you want to look at this further. But the big thing here is thinking about how that changes over time. So tracking the impact of changing condition and changing asset value. The key thing here is that we're responsible for this asset just like your house, and we want to make sure that we put enough into it to make sure that we're just not just taking all the value from it and leaving a liability for someone that comes after us. So we want to do the right thing, and using asset valuation is a great way to communicate that. There's an example here from Colorado DOT where they've started to, this is from an asset valuation report they went and did in 2016. They're actually updating this analysis now in 2022 for their current asset management plan. And one of the things that they're really grappling with is the fact that there's been a huge increase in the amount of asset that they're responsible for. So when they look at valuation, the amount of asset or the value of the asset that they're responsible is significantly different to what it was back in 2016. And they can start to have a conversation about, well, what are the investment levels we have to maintain this asset, that this valuable asset that we have for many, many reasons. The example we have on the screen here is from Caltrans, and so this is from their asset management plan. So they're communicating some outcomes here regarding the condition of their assets. So you can see on this diagram here their current performance. They have just under 60% good, and their gap there is about 30%. So their target is 90% of these traffic signal and ITS assets in good condition. They're currently 30% away from that. They are showing in here that their 10-year expected outcome is to get to that 90% good. Okay, so that's great news for Caltrans. Really happy for them that they've obviously got some funding there and they're able to do that. But they're communicating that as an outcome that they're expecting to achieve. And in order to do that, they've got a long way to go. So they've obviously got an agreement to that. They have the resources available. But now over a 10-year period, they're going to be improving 3% a year. So they're going to want to make sure they continue to track that. And that to see how they are going in terms of achieving that, set themselves goal, make sure they've got the ability to utilize those additional resources and are achieving that goal they're committing to within their asset management plan here. I know that Caltrans' latest asset management plan is now available online, their 2022 TAMP, so it'll be interesting to see check that and see how they've got on with their traffic signals and ITS assets. So from a resource allocation perspective, the first step is to develop a process to analyze and come up with some investment strategies. Look at those, produce those, and see what you can achieve there from a performance outcome perspective. Consider using asset valuation as a good way of communicating how you are investing in your assets and maintaining that value over time. And be sure you give a lot of consideration to how you communicate those outcomes, communicate the strategies, make sure those that are making the decisions about your resources and your funding understand the implications of those decisions they're making and what that's going to mean into the future. And then remember, once those decisions are made, you need to work out how you're going to deliver to them. So whether there's more, less, or the same funding, just to make sure that you are optimizing the delivery of that to make sure that that those outcomes that you're reporting are achieved. So that's a quick review of the themes that we came up with through this project. And Joe, the final primer, I know that it's getting very close, and it should be available very soon, is what I'm expecting.
Yeah, that's right, Gareth. So it's we're going through the final formatting stage, so we're hoping to post it on our website within the next couple of weeks. So what I'll do is I'll put the link to our Asset Management for Operations website in the chat box. So if you want to go back to it in a couple of weeks and check it out, hopefully it'll be up there. So like I said, it should be any time now. Yeah, thank you, Gareth, for this for going over this material. So what, like we mentioned before, the material that we've covered today, it basically summarizes what's going to be in the document. The document's going to go more in depth in terms of what we're finding in these themes and a lot of the examples that we've covered. With that, I can turn over to Nilu, or we can take questions. How do you want to do this, Nilu? Well, let's go ahead. Yeah, we can open the floor for any questions.
And as people coming up with those questions, Joe, there's also there's a number of other resources I think you've raised in the past. I don't know if it's possible to share those through the chat. Some recent initiatives that have been going on that people might also want to refer to.
Yeah, what I can do is I can post a couple of links. We've hosted a peer exchange through the Center of Excellence here back in 2020 on connecting TSMO and asset management. It was primarily focused toward the TSMO community, but we have a copy of the material that came through that. And then recently, a few months ago, the asset management community posted a similar exchange on asset management and TSMO. So it was geared more toward the asset management audience. And I'll put the link, and that was through the AASHTO Asset Management Committee. So I'll put a link in that chat box for you as well. Those are some resources, and also the FHWA website that I just put the link to. We have some documents that we posted over the past couple of years, and we're going to be hoping to update that soon with some extra documents. You know, I would encourage everyone here just to take a look at it and just see what resources can be helpful to you. But let me see if yeah, go ahead, Gareth.
I was going to say that third link that Joe put up there, the webinar 51 TAMP and TSMO, a number of the agencies that actually contributed quite a lot to the listening sessions we held for this, and the and we did follow-up discussions with them. They were actually featured on that webinar, so you'll hear from some of those agencies that are grappling with some of the things we've talked about today, if you want to go and have a look at that.
Okay, so you know, while we're waiting for any questions, I'll throw one out there. I guess Gareth and team, what recurring challenges have you seen throughout this process that has constantly come up that still seems to be a challenge today?
There's a number of challenges that agencies face when they're sort of tackling this, and I guess the first one that sort of comes to mind is collecting information about your assets and making sure that it's always relevant and up to date. And the challenge there is I know of one agency close to me where they have invested a lot of time and effort in going out and collecting information, having great information about their assets, and then through the year work was done to make changes, improvements, do maintenance on those assets, but that information wasn't being collected or wasn't being updated by those that were responsible for doing the maintenance, and so then they got stuck in a cycle of going out and collecting the information again. So it's a those sort of things. We talked about some ways to sort of make sure that we address that early on in the process, and some of the lessons learned from those that had some success. But that's one of the challenges, I guess, early in the themes we've talked about today that a number of agencies have had.
And this is Chris Finesse. I'll add to that too. I think the bringing attention to ITS assets, especially from decision makers, policy makers, et cetera, within those agencies. I think agency operators understand the importance of these assets, but I think key challenges is bringing those to the forefront. And ways to overcome that, we've been seeing agencies doing is elevating the priorities of these assets. And when I say these assets, ITS, but also we had our signals webinar as well, and creating dedicated funding streams and performance measures, a lot of the areas that we talked about today, starting to elevate the importance of these assets is what we're seeing.
Okay, thanks. So we're starting to get some questions in the chat box, so I'll start reading them. So Tracy's saying, since those earlier projects, how have you seen TAMP for TSMO evolve? Any observations on the overall state of the practice? I can start, and then Gareth and Chris are going to take from there. There seems to be more conversation that's happening in terms of the connections between the two, based on what my observations. We're starting to see more unique challenges that are starting to come up. So one for example is trying to apply an asset management system, a monitoring system for these assets where ITS needing signals, and the challenge of that it's not an apples to apples comparison. So traditionally asset management systems have been focused primarily on pavements and bridges. And when they're trying to apply a lot of them to signals and ITS, we're starting to hear some more conversations about, okay, well, it doesn't fit well in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, especially when you start considering, tracking all the components of these assets as well. So we're starting to hear more of that coming up. So that would suggest that there's more activity in terms of applying asset management principles to these TSMO assets. Another area is TSMO champions in these agencies that are trying to collaborate with other disciplines. So such as planning, that's been going on for a while, but also design, construction, maintenance, but also asset management as well. And looking for those commonalities or those connection points, between these two, that they can really build that kind of relationship. So those are the first couple things that come to my mind. I don't know if Gareth or Chris or Erin, if you have anything to add on to that.
Yeah, and from I guess from the asset management side of things, I've seen a real desire, as sort of building on what Chris said earlier, to want to communicate what's going on with TSMO assets, and that increasing importance of those assets, the increasing challenges that are coming out with them. So right back to the start, Joe, and you mentioned about how these two things are coming together at the same time. I think we're seeing that agencies are recognizing the importance of that. and that evolution in terms of the two pieces coming together, I think, is more and more critical. Whether that's happening across an agency or even within TSMO groups, understanding, having a plan for the future in terms of these assets. And there's been some excellent examples from agencies around in terms of having life cycle plans for how are we going to deal with these things as they age in the future, and there's lots of good examples of that coming out.
All right, thanks, Gareth. Let's see, looking at some more questions here. We did a similar webinar a few days ago on applying asset management for signals. How similar or different are the two, and in what ways? Yes, and we did 2 days ago, because we're coming up with a separate primer on applying asset management for signals. The concept is the same in terms of trying to align it with the MAP 21 requirements. Now with signals, it can be it can have its own uniqueness in that a lot of signals are owned and operated by local agencies, so they're not necessarily on the hook for developing TAMPs, but we also want to make that a resource if they want to use this to apply asset management principles to the signals as well. So I don't know, Gareth or Chris, if you want to take this question.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of debate about this, within our company in terms of, and the presentations that we've had today and a couple of days ago are very similar. The principles that we're talking about apply to a lot of different assets. I mean, these are assets that there's a lot of technology involved in these assets, so some of the things that we've talked about, a lot of stuff we talked about today are equally applicable. And I think we're seeing, I see the principles are very much the same in terms of what we've applied today. And I think there's another comment there within the chat box. There's a range of different assets that can, that these principles can be applied to a range of different assets. And I see that the signals and ITS stuff it's very similar.
Yeah, I would just build on that, Gareth. We saw a lot of those principles really can be applicable. I think it's more in the details when you get to those, when you start fleshing out those principles is when you start to see the differences. So like, for example, when Gareth was talking about the hierarchy and the attributes, those breakdowns of components and how those components are built up and what are important to the agency versus maybe what's not necessarily as important. When it comes from a component view, we're starting to see differences there. The actual specific techniques, the different type of life cycle techniques that we looked at can vary. A reactive approach versus a condition-based might vary based on a signal versus a various type of ITS device. So that's where we're starting to see a lot of some differences, but I agree and support, at the principle level, a lot of similarities, those 5 principles.
All right, thanks. Looking at the chat box, the next question is, how do you ensure contractors key in or accurately report equipment updates? I guess I would need to know what exactly you mean by equipment. Are you talking about the ITS asset or a different kind of equipment?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume we're talking about, whether it's maintenance or management or updates to equipment that happens. I think this is a real challenge I've seen within agencies in terms of making this happen and capturing that through a maintenance management system or an asset management system that a lot struggle with. And to me, a key part of this is wherever possible, having those contractors being able to have access to the system. You'll see one of the agency examples we talked about earlier is having that mobile hardware, making sure it's getting entered by the person on the site and they have access to that and they're able to do that, or at least been able to record it there and for it to be uploaded at a later time. So I think if you're bringing a contractor on board, making sure that you spend a lot of time specifying what they have to do and how they will have to do that, so that they're aware of it, and they, I'm sure if it's with a lot of these things, if you can explain it up front, it probably won't cost you a lot, but if you try and add it at a later date, it's going to be a lot more difficult. But you know, I've seen other examples where an agency didn't require a contractor to do that, and basically, you know, the view of that was that, you know, now all the information we have is not accurate, because we've got one of the groups that has and is intimately involved in these assets, and they're not doing it, so therefore the rest of what we have is not as much use. So it's a critical bit, and make sure that you specify to them what they're going to have to do when they're going to have to do it up front is you know, sort of the key thing.
Yeah, and what we're seeing too is they're doing that during contract renewals. So as those contracts are expiring or being reviewed, they're updating, agencies are updating those requirements that Gareth was talking about, you know, in those updates. I've seen kind of three common ways to do it. One is what Gareth was talking about is directly in the agency system, giving them access. And there's a lot of ways that you can control access with various security levels and user profiles, so that contractors only have certain access rights. We also see a contractor might have their own system, and it might integrate with the agency systems a little bit more work from an IT viewpoint, getting that set up and maintaining that, but that's definitely an option. And then, you know, your more basic option is having a templated spreadsheet that is already configured to easily upload into your system, and giving that to the contractor so that they fill out the spreadsheet and then it gets uploaded directly into your system. So those are some common ways that we've seen agencies do that.
Great, thanks. Let's see, next question talks about looks like an upcoming NCHRP project on integrating TSMO and asset management would solidify the current effort and work. Perhaps, right. I'm not involved in that particular project. I'm aware that it's out there and maybe starting soon if it hasn't already. So I'd be curious to see what comes out of it. But I think there's multiple connection points between TSMO and asset management, and probably this project and maybe this NCHRP project and other projects that we're doing hit on different ones. So if you get enough connection points, it'd be an opportunity just to see where we can put all those together. Next one, does the website you provide contain some of this information? Yeah, it will. We mentioned earlier the document for this should be on our website on one of the links that I posted within the next couple of weeks. It's going through the final formatting changes. So once it comes out, we can send out an announcement for that. And we got one from Tom Carney. Friendly reminder, telemetry deployed for virtual weigh station operations should all be considered as part of your ITS assets. Gantries and roadside poles and roadside data processing cabinets are part of these asset sets. Everything Gareth presented is directly applicable to these assets. Ensuring these field deployed truck size and weight technologies are included in your regional ITS architecture. And that's a very good point, Tom. And we do see some applicability in terms of not just TSMO assets, you know, even though freight would be included in that, but also specifically toward freight, because recognizing that a lot of state agencies, their departments between TSMO and freight are different and may or may not talk to one another. You know, an effort like this can help build that level of collaboration. So I appreciate you pointing that out, Tom. Okay, I believe I hit all the questions, but if not, let me know.
There was one there.
I think there was one, Joe.
Oh, there is one? Let's see.
Yeah, there's one about support any.
Marlon.
Yeah, from Marlon. Is support any tracking on the support structures these assets are on? And I guess when I saw that one, I was thinking, you know, Marlon, there you might be talking about we're talking a lot about the technology today, but obviously there's a lot of time this technology sits on a structure. And we're seeing a lot of agencies already or are currently working on how they go out and assess those structures and realize that that's part of the asset they need to manage as well. There was an example from the in the other presentation we gave on traffic signals. There was an example there where Minnesota DOT within their 2019 TAMP, as part of the life cycle planning work they did, they looked at the traffic signal structure that the technology was sitting on and looked at that and showed that by going out and inspecting that and doing repairs rather than waiting for things to get to the point where all you could do is replace it, that it was actually going to save them money in the long run. So they had done some analysis on that. So the structure is one of those components of these assets, and it is something that you'd want to think about. What is your approach for managing that structure itself?
All right, great. Thanks, Gareth. I'm just searching the chat box for any more questions that may have popped up. Not seeing any. We can do one last call for questions, and if not, we can wrap up a little bit early. But again, definitely want to thank Gareth and team for all they've done for this effort. So, and just keep a lookout the next, like I said, next couple of weeks for the documents themselves. I see some folks typing in here, so I'll give them a few seconds. All right, great. Okay, so if there's nothing else, again, thank you all, and hopefully this last hour to hour and a half has been helpful to you, and you can take this information back home to your agency. But we're hoping to expand on this more in the next couple of years, and recognizing that the next round of TAMPs will be updated this summer and fall for depending on what state you're in. We're hoping to maybe build off of that and just see what other opportunities can present themselves. So with that, I will turn it back over to Neela.
Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciated everyone's presentation, all the discussion, and wanted to quickly mention that we're going to post the recording of this webinar as well as the PDF of the slides on the NoCall website in the on-demand learning section of it. So make sure to check that out. And without further ado, thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.